Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. So let's keep going. Phenomenology of perception. Let me see if I can get this right. We are video 12.2 of 18. We're in part 2, the perceived world, and this is the first chapter, sensing. So it's the second part of that first chapter, and we'll finish the first chapter in this video. And we'll start with a section I call natural perception. And when I say I call it natural perception, Merleau-Ponty calls it natural perception, but that's just the way I've broken this down, this chapter, broken it up into different parts. So, okay, natural perception, what is it? Perception is, the first thing Merleau-Ponty says, perception is accomplished with the whole body at once. So it's fundamentally intersensory. That's the idea. And this just gets us away from that type of intellectualist thinking whereby we receive a bunch of different sensory inputs through different sensory modalities, and then we have to, through an act of consciousness, unify or bring all of these different inputs together and unite them in some way. We can kind of circumvent that. That's what Merleau-Ponty is doing by getting underneath this. That's that second order reflective kind of analysis. By getting under that, getting beneath that at this level of what Merleau-Ponty calls natural perception, we see that perception is fundamentally, originally, intersensory. So it's automatically, in a way, it's automatically unified already. We don't have to bring there's not a second act taking place here by which we have to synthesize or unify all of these different sensory inputs. So perception is fundamentally whole body and intersensory. And the opposite then, the experience of isolated senses or isolated sense input, takes place within what Merleau-Ponty calls an abnormal attitude. So something that's our original experience is intersensory. When we abstract out from that, then we can look and see, or then we can realize the contributions of the individual senses. But originally, it's a united whole. And so the example he gives is of a room. I think it's a dimly lit room, or a room with shadows and light coming in through a window. And there's white paper in the room, and we see the white paper. We recognize it as white paper. But if we actually focus on each piece of paper, we realize that not all of them are completely white. That's not what is, that's not the literal sensory input we're receiving. Some of the paper's in shadow, so it's going to appear a little bit darker than other pieces of paper which are in the light, and they appear bright white. But we don't see that. We don't see paper of different colors or different shades. We see white paper. And it's only once we adopt this abnormal attitude and focus on some of the pieces of paper individually and kind of analyze what we're getting in terms of sensory input, then we appreciate, then we realize, okay, it's not white. But that's what this original natural perception gave us. That's how we perceived the paper in the room. Was originally just as white paper. And it's not until we break down that original perception, that we find not all of the paper is strictly speaking white. But that's what Merleau-Ponty means, that's an abnormal approach. It's abstracting things from their natural environment, from the natural context in which we perceive them. And what allows us to do this, what arises, what gives gives rise to this abnormal attitude in which we see, or we apprehend the contribution of the individual senses is focus. So if we think about focus from the object side, what focus does is it separates a region from the rest of the field, which is just basically what I said. We take one of those pieces of paper in isolation from the other pieces of paper, from the room that we're in, and just focus on that and what are the sensible qualities we're getting. When we focus like that, then we see the paper appears as maybe a grey, with a grey colour. But doing this, the nice quote from Merleau-Ponty is that this interrupts the total life of the spectacle. So focusing is it's a disruptive kind of approach. And that's kind of opposite to the way we typically in our scientific objective age think about things. We think focus heightens clarity. It gives us more information. It gives us better information. But in a way, Merleau-Ponty is saying the opposite happens. When you focus, you interrupt the total life of the spectacle. You get the second order analytic information rather than getting what your original experience was about. And from the subject side, what happens when we focus is that we substitute for overall vision an isolated vision which we direct at will. So we get, instead of this kind of inclusive orientation towards things in the phenomenal field, in our milieu, rather than that, we get this isolated vision which now acquires an element of now it's connected to me, it's personal. Remember, prior to that it was this impersonal, anonymous field. Focus makes the field personal now. Now it relates directly to me, and I can control my focus. I can direct my gaze upon different parts of the scene before me. So sensible qualities then are a product of an attitude of curiosity or of observation. Again, just taking things out of their natural, meaningful, lived significations that they have. And Merleau-Ponty has another nice expression for this. He says, what we do when we focus is we pulverize the world into sensible qualities. And that's a beautiful expression. And you can imagine, you can see it's kind of disruptive. It breaks the flow. It breaks that communion that we have. It takes things out and just tears them apart and looks at the pieces that are left. And in doing that, we tend to think we're getting a better picture. We now understand the total, the whole, better. But in actual fact, we don't, because once we break the thing apart, break our perception apart, we can't put them back together and get what we had before that. We always get this abstract, disengaged picture. So that was a really nice way of putting that. So natural perception is this originary layer of sensing prior to the division of the senses. Okay, that's kind of what I've talked about. And so this is interesting. So prior to the division of the senses, so everything's intersensory. Let's look at that in a bit more detail. What that means then is that sights, sounds, tastes, all of the different modalities of sense, they're all modifications of our entire body. So our body is kind of the locus for all of these senses, and it's there that perception takes place. And he has we kind of saw that already with the raising, when you raise your arm when you're looking at different colors, your arm you raise your arm more smoothly or in a jerkier fashion, depending on the visual context. But he has a couple of other examples. He says that some experiments have shown more intense sounds intensify our perception of colors. So if we're submitted to kind of intense oral stimulation, that creates a stronger visual perception of colors. Interrupting sounds makes colors vacillate for us in our perception, in our vision. That's another example. And all of this is impossible to explain under the constancy hypothesis, that hypothesis of mechanical cause and effect. There's something more going on in perception than just billiard balls bouncing around, cause effect. And he talks about synesthesia here. And he describes the experience of some subjects who've taken mescaline and the way that they perceive colours when they hear sounds. So that's synesthesia, right? The kind of mixing or overlapping of different sensory modalities. And he says the neuroscience can't explain this because the subject doesn't report a sound and a colour at the same time. It's not, if we look at different parts of the brain, for example, that are active when someone is perceiving colours when they're hearing sounds, what we're not getting is both a sound and a colour. Rather, the subject says they're seeing the sound. They're not hearing the sound and seeing a colour. So to reduce it to just the activation of different parts of the brain doesn't give us a full account of the subject's perception, which is that they are seeing sounds. And so, I've written here too, individual senses can't be explained with reference to specific qualia. So that's that idea again. We can't just look at what's kind of happening in the mind's apprehension. We can't reduce these things to specific mental experiences. There's a broader context we have to look at. And in a surprising move, but if you reflect on it, I think you'll see that it's correct and really insightful. Merleau-Ponty says synesthesia is actually the norm. It's the normal way that we perceive, the normal way that we sense. And this is that intersensory element of this originary perception that Merleau-Ponty is talking about. He says the senses communicate among themselves naturally. So you don't have to take mescaline to appreciate what Merleau-Ponty is saying. And some of the examples he gives are when the way that we can see the fragility in a glass. If you look at a glass, you get more than just the visual a visual impression. You can almost see the feel. It's a kind of a tactile thing. You can feel how fragile it is just through looking at it. Another example, which was nice too, is hearing the hardness and unevenness of cobblestones on the ground when a tire rolls over them. They make that crunching sound. You get the audio qualities, but you also hear that the hardness in them. Again, a tactile thing. You can hear how hard they are. You can hear their unevenness. So there's a visual impression that you're receiving, and that's just through listening, just through hearing. So our senses, we can even in normal everyday experience, we can appreciate, we can understand, we can get an insight into this idea of synesthesia, the idea that we're fundamentally intersensory. We're not receiving different, separate, isolated data from different sensory modalities, and then having to put them together. The sound brings with it some tactile sensation or a visual. It evokes a visual response in us. But we don't realize this, or we've overlooked this, because we've been conditioned by science, by that objective, analytical approach. And he says that in an interesting passage, we've unlearned seeing, hearing, touching. We've unlearned the way that we actually experience through our senses. And this goes back to what we talked about a while ago, replacing the reflective idea, the concept, for genuine experience, which is what we've done, which is what our modern scientific age does. It disregards the actual experience in favor of an idealized, completely objective account, something that's abstracted out from a broader, more inclusive context. So I thought that was interesting. We've unlearned seeing and hearing and experience, sensation. And what Merleau-Ponty's doing is just trying to kind of reawaken that in us. Okay, so we also talk, or he goes on to talk about this idea, this unity of the senses, this intersensory perception, or the way that perception is intersensory, through another example, another experiment with monocular and binocular imagery. Okay, so monocular and binocular images. The what Merleau-Ponty is talking about here is essentially it's the way that we perceive objects, we visualize objects, we see objects with the eyes, with an eye working the eyes working separately, which is monocular, or working together, which is binocular vision. So one way to think about this is if you gaze into the distance, a nearby object appears as two separate objects. It appears in two images, which are hazy and unclear. And focusing on that object brings those two images together, and you get the clear image. But what's going on with this process when we take those two objects and focus on them and bring them into one? What's happening? So the first thing Merleau-Ponty says is this isn't causality. It's not a causal relation here. For example, where the normal vision, where we see the single object, is the effect of a convergence of the eyes. So that's not the case, and the reason for this is that the focus, the narrowing of my gaze to focus on that object, is a specific intention. And that means that it requires the double vision to be experienced as disequilibrium. So we have to, there's no reason why seeing those two images would lead us to focus on the object and bring the two images together. There's no mechanical, physical explanation for that. It's purely an act of intention. It's down to my intention. So there can't be a causal connection between the two objects and the single and the kind of the desire to create a single object that comes from from me as a subject. So there's no physical, mechanical, causal explanation here. And also the single image that we get when we focus our gaze isn't just a superimposition of the two images. It's not like we're taking these two images and just throwing them together. Rather, we get an image that it's much clearer, it's more solid, it's more concrete than it was when we were seeing both images. So again, there's more happening in this act than just mechanical cause and effect. And it's also not intellectual. It's not the result of any kind of reflective mental activity of a kind of consciousness separate from the scene. And this is because what's happening is again, it's not something in a kind of locked away mind. What's happening is the two eyes, our two eyes, are no longer functioning in isolation, but rather they become a single organ under a unique gaze. So we have a situation here, that convergence of our eyes. It can't be this apprehension that we get, this vision that we have of this object, and the clarity that we now obtain is not a result of a reflective mental process. It's very, very much physical, obviously, in the sense that we're dealing with our eyes, but it's more than just directing our eyes somewhere. Rather, we're taking these two objects, or these two sensory receivers, and instead of treating them as individual, we're treating them as a single unit. So that we're back to this idea of senses uniting, of perception being fundamentally intersensory. And here, even though it's the same sense, vision, we've still got two receivers, which are now not functioning as two receivers, but functioning as one. And so this is something that it's not reducible to an act of consciousness. And when we do that, when we converge our gaze on the object itself appears transcendent, out there in the world, as having, what Merleau-Ponty says, a carnal presence. So we're again, there's nothing about this which is locked in a transcendental ego, a mind operating divorced from the physical. And in addition to this, there's quite a long quote which I'm going to throw up and read for you. The ipseity is never attained. Each appearance of the thing that falls before our perception is still nothing but an invitation to perceive more, and a momentary pause in the perceptual process. If the thing were attained, it would from then on be stretched out before us without any mystery. It would cease to exist as a thing at the very moment that we believed we possessed it. What makes up the reality of the thing is thus precisely what steals it from our possession. The aseity of the thing, its irrecusable presence and the perpetual absence into which it withdraws, are two inseparable aspects of transcendence. Intellectualism is unaware of both. And the reason I quoted that long quote there is it goes back to what we talked about in the last video, the idea that you never get the whole thing. You never get the object in its entirety. It always holds something back from us. Every perception is an invitation to perceive more, a momentary pause in our perceptual process. And if we were able to grasp the thing in its entirety, so it was stretched out before us without any mystery, it would cease to exist as the thing, as a thing, at that very moment for us. what makes it real, what makes it a thing, is this fact that it shows us something while hiding something else. And I described it earlier as the thing having a kind of density. A density that means that we're unable to kind of see through it and see all of it. We only get, it always holds something back. And it's that which gives the thing its thingness. And the word, I think, that kind of captures that idea is the way that the object is dense. It has some density, meaning that it's not transparent to us. It's not bare, it's not laid open before us, so we can see it in its entirety. And without that, without this aseity, what makes it the thing, a thing that exists in itself, it wouldn't be a thing at all. And so this presence and the absence of the thing, the way that it reveals itself and covers some of itself at the same time, intellectualism can't explain this. And that's because, if you remember, intellectualism, the idea of the consciousness is a constituting consciousness. Consciousness is the measure of the thing. The thing is only the thing because I make it a thing. I see it as a thing. Remember that's what intellectualism is. The consciousness is the measure of being. Things have meaning because I give them meaning. And in that case, there is nothing hidden in the object, because I am the knower, and the object is known only in as far as I know it. And so from that perspective, intellectualism can't account for any, or can't admit any hiddenness, any aspects to the object which are beyond my grasp, or beyond my grasp at the moment, or at a single time. And that's why intellectualism doesn't work. That's why it doesn't explain these. It can't account for our original perception. So monocular, sorry, monocular and binocular images, and we can take this insight from monocular, this monocular binocular insight directly, and apply it directly to the unity of the senses. So I've got a quote which I'll put up, and then I'll discuss in a bit of detail. The synthesis of the different senses takes place through a never completed integration into a single knowing organism. The intersensory object is to the visual object what the visual object is to the monocular images of double vision. And the senses communicate in perception just as the two eyes collaborate in vision. And so basically there, Merleau-Ponty is just saying that if we think of the way that the visual object arises, it arises for us when the two eyes function as one. When our two eyes, they're no longer operating individually on their own, which gives us the two images. Rather, when they work together, this kind of unifying action, then we get the visual object. And the same thing can be said about the sensory object, sensing itself. The sensory object arises when our different senses operate as one. And that one is the body. When our different senses work together, then we get this intersensory object. And so that's the parallel. Nice parallel. I think it's a good analogy. The two eyes working together gives us a visual object, and all of our senses working together give us our sensory objects. I should have said that. That's a very easy way to explain that. And this is true not just of sensory objects, objects in the external world, but also of cultural objects. So the same thing happens here, and the example Merleau-Ponty gives is words. And the experiment he refers to is where words appear on a screen or are shown too quickly for conscious recognition to take place, but they still induce a physical response. So there's still this this reaction in the body. And the example he gives is if the word hard is flashed on the screen, again at a level or shown too quickly for the individual, for the subject to consciously recognize, it elicits a kind of stiffness in the back, and so there's that connection. There's, you know, the way that our body responds to to the way that different objects appear for us in terms of sensory qualities. And you could object, perhaps, sorry, my throat's going. You could object that this is just a subconscious thing. This is just what it's happening beneath conscious awareness. But that's the point, that the body orients us to the world. It adapts us to the environment without concepts at this not subconscious but pre-conscious level. Now all of this tells us something about the body. As always, things often tend to come back to the body for Merleau-Ponty, and obviously they tell us that our body is not an object among other objects, like other objects, but also it tells us that it is an object sensitive to all others, which resonates for all sounds, vibrates for all colours, and that provides words with their primordial signification through the manner in which it receives them. Brilliant. It's another great description, and I don't think I can improve on it or really need to add anything. Our body it resonates for all sounds, vibrates for all colours. It's the way that we're this isn't a word that Merleau-Ponty uses, but it attunes us to the world, and adapts us, orients us. There's all that way of seeing, that way of thinking about perception and sensing. It's just so appealing to me. And he goes on to say, when I perceive something, the act of perception completely occupies me. And basically that means I can't perceive myself perceiving. So I'm either caught up in it, I'm involved in it, I'm in that phenomenal field, or I'm not. And I can't get out of it to see myself, to reflect on myself in this act of perceiving, without breaking the act of perceiving, or without shifting the act of perceiving backwards, if you like. So that now the perceiving is not when I'm actually perceiving. Now the perceiving is me perceiving myself perceiving. And again, you just can never kind of get behind yourself to see yourself. That's kind of the idea. So yeah, in order to perceive myself, I have to necessarily break the perception by interjecting a reflective movement, which decomposes perception into qualities and sensations, thereby requiring an act of synthesis to bring them all together. But Merleau-Ponty is saying the whole point, there is no act of synthesis required. And it's not actually there. There is no synthesis in actual perception, because every perception is already synthesized. It's already intersensory. We don't need to do anything. We only need an act of synthesis if we've already separated everything, if we've broken it all apart. Then we need to put it back together. But originally, in this natural perception, it's already unified. It's already synthesized. Okay, so there's a little section which is perhaps not so easy to understand, Merleau-Ponty talks about temporality in relation to this. So this is, it's a, actually, I've been through it a few times. It does kind of make a bit of sense, which is good, I guess. He doesn't go into it in a lot of detail, and we haven't really looked at temporality yet. So it can be, I think we just have to take it on a little bit of faith at the moment, but we'll look at temporality in much more detail later. So what he says is that the perceptual synthesis that we're talking about here, this intersensory, the way that perception is intersensory and a whole rather than these disparate qualities or sensory impressions being put together. This synthesis is actually a temporal synthesis. And what he's saying here is that perception is grounded in temporality. And that's going to be his ultimate move at the end. I'll give you a quote and then we'll look at it in a bit of detail. So when I first open my eyes, my consciousness is immediately flooded with colours and confused reflections. At that moment, my consciousness is hardly distinguished from what is presented to it. It spreads out through its body into the spectacle that is not yet a spectacle of anything. So this is very interesting, a very interesting thing to say, that it's like vision is not something you get just by having eyes. It's you have to kind of acclimatize yourself to vision. You have to acclimatize yourself to seeing the world. And this I crossed it out, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to talk about it. There's a book called Incognito by David Eagleman. I think he's a neuroscientist, but he describes someone who was blind and had been from a really young age. I forget why, but there was some surgery became available which fixed the problem. So he was able to see, and as an adult, he had this surgery. And he was able to see for the first time that he could remember. And they took the bandages off, and all of his family were there. And so he reacted happily. But later he said he couldn't see anything. All he could see was this jumbled mass of colour and light and darkness and shading. But there was no, he couldn't see the faces of his family because he just didn't have, the neuroarchitecture, I guess, wasn't there to support it. Ultimately, that's what was happening in his brain. And so the interesting idea is that vision is something you have to acquire. It's not something you get for free, as it were, just by having a pair of eyes. It's a little bit off track, but that was just interesting. And I guess if you think about it, it's the same with babies too, right? The first thing they see, they have to learn how to see. They don't just see faces. But it is interesting too. Because you would think, and this goes then against kind of the mechanical interpretation as well, where sensory, you're receiving light and areas of light and darkness hitting your retina, following the optic nerve and getting translated and whatever that process is. But if it were just mechanical, like a video camera, you'd just be able to open your eyes and see. There wouldn't be any mystery because you're just getting what's out there. A video camera doesn't have to learn how to take a picture or how to record something, but the human eye does. So that already tells you there's more going on than just sensory input. Striking a retina, sending signals up a nerve. There's an act behind this, an act of perception, an act of vision. And that's what Merleau-Ponty points out here. when you first open your eyes, that's what happens. You're just flooded with all of this information. It doesn't make any sense. You don't get any, there is no spectacle before you. There is no environment that you're immediately aware of. So my body has to orient itself towards the things, the objects, to make them actual. And the way Merleau-Ponty says it does this is ultimately through temporality. And his explanation of this, again, you don't have to, this isn't a detailed explanation, he just gives a really bare bones description. But he says basically I send the object attacking me, that's how he describes it, just kind of flooding me with visual information. I send the object which is attacking me like this back to the world by myself retreating to the future, sending the object into the immediate past. So I'm bombarded by all of this deluge of light and dark and shadow and all the rest of it. And the way I make sense of it is by escaping to the future, which has the effect of sending the object into the past. So it gets me kind of away. It gives me a bit of a break from that. And I can then orient myself towards it by intending it as if it were a near future. And so once I've kind of pushed the object back into the past, given myself a break, then I can orient myself towards it by treating it as an object in the near future, something I can intend towards. And that is what lets us perceive objects. So the act of, in this case, seeing, is both prospective and retrospective. And these are terms that we'll become familiar with later. And it's a very, it's kind of a metaphorical way of talking about it, but we have to start thinking in those terms, because when we're dealing with something like temporality, with time, I think we are going to have to change the way that we think about time, typically in like a scientific perspective, because there's something fundamentally something that we can't really account for in terms of dimensions, in terms of like spatial dimensions, pure physical, the pure physical world around us. But we'll get to that later. But anyway, there is this, it's interesting to note there's another double horizon here, this prospective and retrospective approach that Merleau-Ponty takes, the grounding for perception. We have this double horizon of the prospective and the retrospective, reminiscent of that double horizon we saw earlier, way back in the beginning, of figure, and the inner horizon of figure and the outer horizon of background and unseen aspects of the thing. So that's interesting, and I think just shows how Merleau-Ponty is going to connect these ideas together and kind of put everything into a temporal framework. One other interesting idea before I leave this topic is that the temporality undergirding perception is undertaken in the impersonal mode of the one. So that's another interesting idea. Temporality is originally not a personal quality. It's not my past that I'm originally aware of, or that originally arises when I think of when this kind of retrospective temporal act arises for me. It's not bound to me. It's not connected with me. We're back to this impersonal, anonymous way of thinking, which you would expect, given that the phenomenal field itself is impersonal and anonymous. The the transcendental field, which is the field beneath, or our analysis of that field itself, will also have to be impersonal and anonymous. And Merleau-Ponty just throws that in here. Again, there's no real description, though. We'll come to that a little bit later in the book. Okay, let me give you a few final thoughts before we head to a summary. Right, so final thoughts. Intellectualism, what does it do? Intellectualism objectifies sensation. So it creates an empty consciousness and turns the hyal, the matter, into a real thing, making an encounter between the two impossible. And that's essentially what Sartre has done as well, isn't it? With the for itself and the in itself. The for itself is literally nothingness for Sartre. The in itself is being, and there's no way to connect those. Obviously, it's definitely what Descartes did with his substance, two substances. You've got mind substance and external substance. There's just no connection between the two. If we want to get our reflection right, if we want to reflect on this and understand perception correctly, we need to recover the unreflective experience of the world. And what we then find is not a given multiplicity along with a synthetic apperception that surveys it and thoroughly penetrates it, but rather a certain perceptual field against the background of the world. Nothing here is thematized. Neither the object nor the subject is posited. In the originary field, we do not have a mosaic of qualities, but rather a total configuration that distributes functional values according to the demands of the whole. And as we have seen, for example, a white sheet of paper in the shadows is not white in the sense of an object of quality, but it has the value white. What we call sensation is merely the most basic of all perceptions, and as a modality of existence, sensation can no more than any other perception be separated from a background that is ultimately the world. Just as a point of note, that apperception there in the very first sentence, very first line, is a reference to Kant's, that's a term that Kant uses, which basically means self-consciousness, the conscious perceiver, him or herself, the unifying understanding. And the whole passage there basically just it's just a nice summary, I think, of everything that we've been talking about. And I don't think I need to say anything more about that. Finally, the last thing I've got is originary perception is then non-thetic, pre-objective, and pre-conscious. And that's what that's the thing to take away. That's the take-home message from this. So let's hit a summary quickly. First, we looked at sensation, and there was that nice word, a communion. Sensation is a communion. It's the way that we adapt ourselves to the thing, to the world. And we discussed the way that the thing is active, not just a passive object out there for us to approach and to manipulate in ways and to impose value on or meaning on, as if we were a disinterested consciousness. And I liked that expression, the thing thinks itself in me. So that really highlights the idea that the thing is not passive. We also looked at natural perception, and the important idea is that this is a whole body experience, a whole body act. And that makes it intersensory as well. So we're not dividing, we're not receiving separate qualities or sensory impressions and then having to piece them together. They come to us. The way that we originally experienced them is in this united form. Individual qualities, sensible qualities, arise from an attitude of curiosity or observation. And this was what Merleau-Ponty called focus. Remember that expression, pulverising the world into sensible qualities. the body, the insight into the body here was that it's an object which is sensitive to all other objects. It resonates with the sounds. It vibrates for all colors. That was the one. And finally, there was a little bit on temporality, and basically the idea is that perception is grounded in temporality. And we talked about that kind of double horizon there. Originally, we pushed the object back into the past, into the immediate past, sorry, and then we, in order to orient ourselves towards it, we bring it before us. We make it of it an intention, thereby making it, putting it into our immediate future. And that is the first chapter, sensing. So hopefully that helps, hopefully that clarifies, doesn't make things more confusing. But yeah, we're churning through this. Thanks for watching. Hopefully it helped. Should I say it again? Yeah, one more time. Hopefully it helped. And I'll catch you in the next video. Thanks again.